I'm going to show how to change a black and white image into a bitmap image. For those of you working with photographic based images, if you would like to retain as much of the value information as possible, you will want to bitmap your image to break it down into pure black and white dots to use for screen printing. Otherwise, if you print out an image like this where there's a lot of gray tones, during the exposure process, only what is the darkest will be exposed, and oftentimes what is gray, it either might expose, but it'll turn into one solid black or one solid open stencil, or it won't expose at all, and so just having the darkest darks show up. So in order to retain a bit of the range of values with just one black and white image, this is just one way to go about making a halftone image. So the first thing I do is I unlock the layer. Oftentimes when you first import a picture, it's locked, so I go ahead and do that. Now for what I'm doing, because I want to see how much of these midtones I want to keep, I'm not going to do too many adjustments. But something you might do is play around with the brightness and contrasts, the curves panel. I like to sometimes play around with increasing the amount of darker images. Now for screen printing, there is something called dot gain. So sometimes what happens if you have like a very dark image or an image with a lot of dark marks, it'll end up filling out or producing a wider dot pattern. Or so sometimes I will adjust the levels and reduce the output of the black layer. And sometimes what that does is it goes ahead and makes sure that the darkest darks aren't going to dot gain and bleed together when I do my screen print. But I don't always do this, and it's fun to just experiment with adjusting the output levels. I do that occasionally with the black. So sometimes I'll have this range. So it'll look lighter on my screen, but I know once I get to the screen printing portion, it'll change. Now before bitmapping an image, there's a couple things you will need to do. Again, this is for grayscale or black and white images. You want to go ahead and merge your layers if you've done adjustments. Do any adjustments you need to do before you go to the bitmap layer. So I'm going to merge all the levels together. If you want to be safe, make sure you're saving different copies of your image at different times, so you don't, if you want to go back to that original image. The next thing I want to do is make sure that my image is the size that I'd like to print before I go to bitmapping. Basically, if you bitmap an image and it's a super huge file, if you try to make it smaller after you bitmap the image, the dots and the lines and the patterns that's created will shrink. And sometimes that's not always a good thing in screen printing, where you might need a certain size dot so that it won't fill in or dry on the screen. So to change the size, I go to image size. Now if you have a huge file, I have an image that's pretty close to what I'm looking for. This is close to, this will fit on an 8.5 by 11 transparency, so I'm going to keep it, but I usually want to keep the resolution to about 300, relatively high. However, if you're interested in the glitchy bitmap look, you can lower the resolution. So if you want something really degraded looking, you can go ahead and have something at 72. Or if you're using a cell phone picture that comes in 72, if you want to keep it, that's okay. But in order to get a higher quality bitmap, you might bump that up. So I'm not doing anything to change my image, but you want to change the size before the next thing. So the next thing we're going to do is change the mode. First, if it's not already in grayscale, you should change it to grayscale first. And after that, you'll want to go to bitmap. Now, if you had several adjustment layers, and sometimes this happens where you go to do this, where you go to change it to a bitmap and it's grayed out, that means you're not in the right layer. So you want to be sure you click the layer that you're working with before you go to bitmapping. So if it's grayed out and it won't let you choose it, it's because you're not on the right layer. So I'm going to go ahead and click bitmap, flatten layers, okay. Now, this is where there's a lot of different information out there. So I'm going to show you two different things that happen. There's some textbooks, some websites that say, keep the output the same as the pixels per inch. So I'll show you what happens. You can experiment with this, the different methods of creating a bitmap file. I tend to lean towards halftone screens for screen printing, but you can also experiment with pattern dither, diffusion dither. However, you have to be cautious because if it's super small, I'll do diffusion dither for example. If it's super duper small, sometimes it won't pick up on the mesh of the screen. So I would probably want to make some adjustments or change that pixel. I don't want to keep that, I'm just gonna Control Z. If you want to make several versions of your image with different bitmaps, that's okay. So usually I just hit Command Z to go back and experiment. So here we go. I'm going to show you the output of 300 pixels per inch with a halftone screen just to show you what happens. 55 might be the best, the finest, most real with screen printing. Of course, if you're working with other mediums, you can increase the frequency for lines per inch. I would not go higher than this just for clarity. So sometimes the higher the frequency, the tinier the lines are. And if it's too small, it's not going to work with your screen. So 55 is the max. I like to go somewhere around 45. However, if you love the like chunky big dots of halftones, you can go like much lower. So I'm going to just show you a comparison with 45. And you can experiment with the angles. There's not really a right or wrong way, but that will change the pattern of dots. So maybe I'll do 60 degrees and show you what that looks like. Now the shape, I tend to lean towards round or ellipse, but you can also check out line, cross, square. Line is, I think, a little bit more common. So I'm going to show you the traditional round, and I want to compare two different things. This is with a 300 output. Something you might notice as you zoom in is this is really jagged. And this is how it would print out on your transparency. It's kind of blocky and chunky, and I don't like that. So I'm going to go back and then I'm going to show you what happens if you change the output. Now, I was told once to change it to the output of the printer you're using itself. And depending on the printer, it could be about 1200 to 2400. I'm going to change it to about 1200. But you can also experiment with anything in between and see which one you like. So without changing anything, I'm going to show you just what changing that output does. So here I have my halftone once again, but now when I zoom in, it's still a little jagged, but these are much smoother and much more less square. So I think if you want more of the traditional look of old-fashioned halftones, bump up that output to about 1200 and it'll create a smoother halftone. Now, of course, this is like pointillism, kind of like Roy Lichtenstein. So if you zoom into it, it looks very abstracted, but once you zoom out, your own eyes, your own brain does the mixing, creates this illusion of a range of values. Okay, say that you're ready to print. You can go to File, Print. You would want to make sure, if you are printing from your home printer, make sure to select the right printer. And also make sure that the paper is in the right direction. They give you this preview here, so make sure that if you have a landscape image, you can do that, and however many copies you want. If you're printing on a laser printer, I would suggest printing at least 2 copies because laser toner, while it works, sometimes doubling up 2 transparencies makes a stronger film, a more opaque film than just a single one, which might still allow some light to pass through. So the better the film quality is, the better the quality of the exposure of the image. So make sure that's in the right direction. Double check some of these. If this is too big for the printer you're using, for example at SOA Print, they might make it a little smaller. But because you've made the resolution for the bitmap as large as it is for a larger output, even if it's printed at a lower resolution, it should be okay. Now, something you can do on Photoshop is add registration marks. And so, great for if you're doing a CMYK print. Sometimes I don't like all of these marks, so I might do a variation of that. Sometimes corner crop marks are enough for me. And you can also choose to make labels. So if you're doing multiple layers or if you have multiple files that look pretty similar, you can do that. For us, we don't have to do any flipping for screen printing. When we get to the pronto plate lithographs later this semester, we'll do emulsion down, which will reflect the image. But we do not have to do that for what we're doing. So I think that is all that you need to do. Now, if you're working with a printer at home, I would suggest switching it to the best mode you can, because that will deposit more ink than just normal printing. So that will give you a more opaque film. So if you're printing at home, these options would be different based off of whatever is available with your print driver. So you might need to change, say, the media and quality. That means you might have to select which one. So a lot of printers don't have transparency as a setting, but you can choose like a glossy paper or semi-gloss, because transparency is pretty glossy. So that'll change how much ink is deposited so it won't bleed. I also suggest when you go to print, you might want to do a test run with regular paper if you don't know which way your transparency feeds. Some transparencies are double-sided, but some are not. I don't remember the brand that I gave for this class, so I'm not sure. It might read the directions on whatever transparencies you get if you're printing at home. With this, I could go ahead and print it. Maybe I'll add some registration marks, and done. If you're printing at George Mason at the SOA print, they might ask you to have a TIFF file. So you can go to Save As and save it as a TIFF. And that will save it as a high quality file. You can also export it as a PDF, and sometimes you can print PDFs from George Mason as well at the SOA print. With FedEx Kinko's, I have the directions on how to print transparencies at FedEx Kinko's on Blackboard. So that should be good to go.